Chapter 26 has a very fascinating figure mentioned that I wanted to spend this entire lecture focusing on. So this may not be very long, and it's not going to be about anybody else, but it's going to be about Mozart. Mozart was born January 27th, 1756 in Salzburg, Austria. He died December 5th, 1791 in Vienna, Austria. He was an Austrian by nationality. He was a composer by occupation. But this guy is very interesting. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was a composer whose mastery of the whole range of contemporary instrumental and vocal forms, including the symphony, the concerto, chamber music, and especially the opera, was unrivaled in his own time and perhaps in any other time. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was born, like I said, in Salzburg in 1756. His father was Leopold Mozart, and he was a noted composer and instructor and also an author of a famous treatise on violin playing. At the time when Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was born, not his father, but his father at that time, Leopold, was in service to the Archbishop of Salzburg, or as we would say in Austrian or German, Salzburg. Together with his sister, Wolfgang received intensive musical training. That by the age of 6, he was a budding composer and an accomplished keyboard performer. And by keyboard, I don't mean Casio. I mean anything that had the keys, so piano, harpsichord, or any variety of interesting keyboard-type instruments. In fact, whenever I was in Prague in early January of 2014, this year, I went and they have a museum, Prague Museum of Music, and there were some instruments there that were very unique that I guess in the long run they didn't really make the cut because they were so obscure. But there were some sheet music. Actually, there was some sheet music there that Mozart had himself handwritten, so that was neat to be able to see. And there was a keyboarded instrument. I don't remember exactly what it was. It might have been a harpsichord that he was believed to have played on. So anyway, so when we say keyboard, we don't mean Casio and Yamaha. Just imagine a very fancy-looking instrument like a piano, but maybe different. In 1762, Leopold presented his son as performer at the imperial court in Vienna, and from 1763 to 1766, he escorted both children on a continuous musical tour across Europe, which included long stays in Paris and London, as well as visits to many other cities with appearances before the French and English royal families. Mozart was one of the most celebrated child prodigies of his time as a keyboard performer, and he made a great impression too as a composer and improviser. In London, he won admiration of, eminent musicians. He was exposed from at an early age to an unusual variety of musical styles and tastes across the European continent. Mozart was essentially, at his core, a believing and practicing Catholic, as seems certain from many of his letters. But we have to acknowledge also, which I think we have to acknowledge a little bit about the fact that he was a Freemason. I talk a little bit more about Freemasonry, I think, in the next chapter. And, but he didn't see a conflict between his religious beliefs and Freemasonry that he became involved with in 1784. And he took an active part in the affairs of the Masonic Lodge, and he actually composed a number of compositions for Masonic occasions that they would play during ceremonies. In fact, one of his most famous Freemason works was the Magic Flute. And it was a play. It was a musical an opera that he created that was supposed to interpret these Masonic values, these Masonic virtues of tolerance, brotherly love, steadfastness, and silence. And so he was openly a Freemason, which is always interesting since that's an esoteric or secret organization. But there were some objections against the liturgical use of some of Mozart's sacred compositions because of he was considered worldly in a sense or secular, and that also trying to perform music, sacred music, church music, and so there some blur the lines between the two. But you know, such a view of the two views can largely be explained by the fact that his operas and his instrumental music have always been more widely known, and many features that simply represent Mozart's own style and that of his period, when encountered in his sacred works, remind some listeners of his secular music. But I think maybe to Mozart, he was a true composer, artist in a sense. When he sat down to compose, he probably had one thing in mind. But to this day, however, his church music regularly receives liturgical performances in Austria and southern Germany. Now, Mozart was also a little bit of a ladies' man, even at a young age. His father recounts him being kissy-faced with the Empress Maria Theresa when he was only 6 years old. When he was 7 and 8 years old, he was strolling down the promenade, kissing the hands of the ladies when he was a child star. So, he was popular, and people, they thought he was pretty awesome for a young, talented musician. And I think that probably had some influence on his life. He was living kind of an adult life even at an early age. But Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, his actual baptismal name, which I wanted to draw attention to, is really important to acknowledge because it kind of embodies a lot about who he was. And names most of the time, not today as much in our culture, but back in when people would give names to their children, there was meaning. There was always a meaning behind why you would baptize a child into a certain name. And so his name was actually Johannes Chrysostomus Wolfgangus Theophilus. And really that's broken down simply into three parts. Johannes Chrysostomus, which is kind of a Latin way of saying John Chrysostom, and that was the saint for whose day he was born on. So that was that saint's day. So they established his Catholic piety by giving him this Catholic saint name. And then Wolfgang is a purely German name, and then Theophilus, which you've probably never heard, attached to his name. And I'll explain in a minute how we get to Amadeus from Theophilus. But Theophilus is Greek for friend of God. In fact, if you look in the New Testament, the book of Luke and the book of Acts are written to a character named Theophilus, which literally means friend of God. Now, if you take the Latin version of friend of God, you get ama, like we have in Spanish. The word amor comes from its Latin root. And then Deus, where we also get the word Dios in Spanish, or deity in English, means God. And so Amadeus is the Latin equivalent to Theophilus. And so Mozart goes down in history as Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Interestingly, like I had mentioned before, Mozart was a Freemason. And some would say, well, what does that matter? But it does actually matter because it's fascinating for one, and it says a lot about just who he was and what he did. And he was part of a Catholic, more than deist kind of lodge, and Freemasonry isn't at its core a Christian organization or anything like that. They may not also be as powerful as many attribute to their grand, conspiracies of New World Order and Illuminati and all that stuff, which I think is kind of hilarious. But anyway, but either way, at the end of the day, they're typically tend to lean more to the deist side, definitely embracing the mystery religions and a lot of the esoteric religions like Mithras and the Egyptian, Horus and Isis and stuff like that. Anyway, so Mozart was, in fact, a Freemason, and he was admitted to the lodge Zur Wohltätigkeit. Anyway, that's my attempt at a really difficult German word. But in case you're unfamiliar with Freemasonry, The fraternal society, secret society known as the Freemasons, may well owe its name and origin to a medieval craftsmen's guild of master builders, but the organization's clandestine nature precludes accurate knowledge of its early stages. In fact, it doesn't have a very solid, traceable root in history. There's a lot of stuff that surrounds Freemasonry. We talk about kind of the myth of its origins, but we don't know. There's not a whole lot of solid fact. In the 18th century, at least, Freemasonry became associated with the humanitarian ideals of the Enlightenment in Western Europe. Though they weren't actually anti-religious, like I said, they talk about the kind of deist. Masonry was persistently opposed to the Catholic Church, and usually regarded with suspicion or worse by reactionary governments, perhaps rightly, for its numbers included many apostles of freer speech and more liberal government. In fact, the founding fathers, George Washington, and some other founding fathers of the American Republic, as we know it, they were Freemasons as well. Many of them had embraced a kind of Christianity and Freemasonry, and I don't deny that. And then also some of them were absolutely outspoken deists. So there you go. But in the Austrian Empire, Freemasonry had been banned by Empress Maria Theresa in 1764. During the 1780s, Emperor Joseph II, who was a more liberal ruler, tolerated that movement. But from 1790, his successor, Emperor Leopold II, returned to the suppression of Freemasonry. But Mozart became a Mason during the calmer years of the 1780s. On December 14, 1784, he was admitted as an apprentice to the Viennese lodge known as Beneficence. And that's actually the word in German that I tried to say a minute ago, but that's the lodge known as Beneficence. The city's most prominent and aristocratic lodge at the time was called the True Concord, and which Mozart frequently visited, and where also on January 7, 1785, he was raised to the second degree, which is the journeyman. There are 32 degrees of Freemasonry, in case you didn't know that. Mozart was promoted to Master Mason in 1786. However, in 1785, the emperor decreed that the 8 Viennese lodges should be combined into 2 or 3, which was a clever political attempt to make it easier to keep an eye on this potentially subversive movement. Just as those who started the American Republic were Freemasons, kind of fighting for this more freer, more liberated kind of government, there was a fear in Austria at the time that they may very well attempt to rise up and overthrow the government. Again, the conspiracy theories were probably just as strong then as they are today. Mozart's lodge was joined with 2 others from the Crowned Hope Lodge to form the Crowned Hope Lodge, and that opened on January 14, 1786. The most renowned expression of Mozart's Freemasonry, as I mentioned before, is, of course, the magic flute, which he did in 1791, and that celebrates the Masonic ideals of truth, brotherhood, love, and incorporates a good deal of Masonic symbolism in its action and stagecraft. Mozart also wrote a number of pieces specifically for the ceremonies of the lodges in the early years of his membership, and again at the end of his life. Mozart produced over 600 musical compositions before he passed away at the ripe young age of 35. I'm 34 now. I'm going to live a lot longer than one more year. And that's unfortunate that such a brilliant mind, such an amazing contributor to the humanities or music had to die young. And a lot of myths surround his death. That's like this image that it was dreary and miserable when he was buried, and he was buried in like a pauper's or peasant's grave. But according to William Stafford, he's a historian, he says it wasn't even stormy the day Mozart died, nor was there snow and rain together at his funeral, and he did not receive a pauper's consecration and burial, but like most Viennese of his day, a third-class funeral and burial in a grave to hold 5 or 6 coffins. And so there's kind of this myth around that because of his poverty, he was buried in a mass grave, but actually it was a cultural thing, and so nobody at the time would have actually thought it to be very strange that he was buried in a grave to hold 5 or 6 coffins. In 1781, Mozart settled in Vienna and enjoyed a few years of renowned success, both artistic and financial, but then it seems his star began to fade, and by the time of his death, he was out of fashion and neglected, chronically short of money and in considerable debt. His death was the turning point. Immediately after this, his fame began to mount. At the time of his death, only about 1/5 of his compositions were in print, but by the early 1820s, nearly 2/3 of them were published and readily available throughout Europe. And so sometimes rock stars have to die in order to get really famous. And I would say even Nirvana or something like that would be an example where Kurt Cobain actually gained greater stardom after his death, and so Mozart would definitely fall into that category as well. When he was 26 years old, he married Constanze von Weber over his father's rejections. The course of his married life never ran smooth. Although his career was artistically successful, he was a poor businessman, and he had a difficult time managing his affairs, especially after his father was no longer able to travel with him. Although his music was performed all over Europe, even by amateurs, and to Mozart's delight, by street musicians, Mozart died in poor circumstances, and we don't deny that. Believing that he had been poisoned, perhaps by a jealous musician, he died December 5th, 1791, and was buried in an unmarked grave. And again, that concept is a little more mythical than it sounds, but those are all true statements. Now, in the process of his final days, he had been willing to write a requiem, and this is another one of the interesting little myths that surround it, which was a funeral mass at the request of someone he knew for that person's dead wife. And rumor has it that he was writing his own requiem, and mysteriously he died before its completion. But there's no compelling evidence that Mozart believed he was writing the requiem for himself, nor reason to think he was poisoned by the composer Antonio Salieri. Jealous of Mozart's superior talent, which they say he was so jealous that he killed Mozart. But Mozart did fall ill in Prague in September, the year he died, but seems to have recovered, and his letters of October and November were actually full of high spirits. If he had not fallen ill again, this time fatally, no mystery would surround the Requiem's composition. His premature death on December 5th, probably of rheumatic inflammatory fever, or I think one was called miliary fever, which was where you have spots on your body that look like millet seeds. But it was an unfortunate event. He died, and he was not buried as the stories would have it in a pauper's grave, but he was given a simple funeral according to the Viennese customs of the time. But Mozart lived a fascinating life and an early death, and he accomplished a lot of great things, and I would say he stands alone, second to none, as an amazing musician and composer, and definitely worthy of some focused attention for Chapter 26.